It is our goal tonight that everyone become more familiar with these ideas, and for this panel to give us a chance at trying to understand other opinions for what they truly are, and not just for what we've been taught to believe about them. Before we officially start, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our sponsors, the Israel Club, the Soldiers in Exile Club, the History Club, and YU PAC, and to all the individuals who have been working tirelessly behind the scenes to make this happen. Thank you. So some ground rules for tonight. We ask that the audience remain quiet during the debate and give the utmost respect to our panelists, so everyone will be able to hear what the panelists each have to share with us this evening. To be very specific, this means no cheering, no applauding, no booing or hissing during the debate. We have reserved approximately 20 minutes for questions and comments after the formal debate. We will pass out index cards, and we ask that you write your questions there. Write to who the question is addressed, write your name, and they will be passed up to our moderator, who will then present your questions to the specified finalists at the end. Now that we're all on the same page of expected conduct, I would like to finally introduce our panelists and moderator. Sitting to my far right is Ambassador Dani Ayalon, who has served a number of Israeli prime ministers, including Ehud Barak, Ariel Sharon, and Benjamin Netanyahu as a national security advisor and as Israel's representative at the United Nations, participating in major peace summits around the world. He was Israel's ambassador to the United States between 2002 and 2006, and Deputy Foreign Minister and member of Knesset for the Israel Beitenu party between 2009 and 2013. The ambassador is currently the Rennet Visiting Professor of Foreign Policy Studies at Yeshiva University. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Dani Ayalon. Sitting in the middle, to the left, is Jeremy Ben-Ami, who is the founder and president of J Street, a liberal advocacy group promoting the vision of two states for Jews and Palestinians. His political resume includes serving in the mid-90s as the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor to President Bill Clinton and working on 7 presidential and numerous state and local campaigns. He was Howard Dean's National Policy Director in 2004 and helped manage a mayoral campaign in New York City in 2001. For nearly 3 years in the late 90s, Jeremy lived in Israel, where he started a consulting firm working with Israeli nonprofit organizations and politicians. He was chosen by America's weekly Jewish newspaper, The Forward, for 3 years as part of the Forward 50, the compilation of the most influential Jewish Americans. He was also one of the 50 People of the Decade selected by Haaretz, the influential Israeli daily newspaper, and the Jerusalem Post included him in the list of the 50 most influential Jews in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeremy Ben-Ami. Sitting in the middle right is Yehuda HaKohen. Yehuda is an international peace activist, is an alternative peace activist and teacher at several Jerusalem institutions. Born and raised in New York City, he made Aliyah in 2001 to enlist in the IDF at the height of the Second Intifada. He has since assumed leadership positions on 3 national election campaigns and worked to foster support for Jewish national rights on several American college campuses. As a leader of the alternative action movement, HaKohen organizes grassroots dialogue sessions for Israeli and Palestinian activists seeking to transcend competing one-sided narratives in favor of a more scientific analysis of the factors forcing both peoples into conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, Yehuda HaKohen. Moderating this debate is Yaacov Sultan, a sophomore at Yeshiva College majoring in political science and government and minoring in French studies. Yaacov has previously worked on 2 national election campaigns this past year in Israel and has continued to be involved in various political groups in Israel and North America. One final announcement before we start. We ask that you please turn off your cell phones. And with that, we are ready to begin the program. Take it away, Yaacov.
First of all, I can only reiterate what the MC said. That is a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. I would also like to reiterate that, please, in the interest of time, we're going to ask the audience to limit the amount of cheering, applause, boos, or hisses during the debate so that we may all concentrate on what the candidates have to say. during their allotted time, and so that we have sufficient time for you, the audience, to ask questions after the debate concludes. Now that all the panelists have met each other, here are the rules. The first two questions are geared for each and every one of you to get a feel of who each candidate is, some of their views, and what they represent. The first two questions will also be focused on topics where we decided were important to hear from all three panelists. The first question will be on pro-Israelism. The second question will be on Jewish history. Then we will move on to the third part of the questioning, which will be personalized questions about the two-state solution that have been geared to each panelist, meaning each panelist will receive a different question on the two-state solution. The fourth part of the questioning will be where each panelist will be able to ask one question to both of their co-panelists on whichever subjects they may choose. Since we obviously want the panelists to interact and question each other, we're going to ask from them to first respond to the questions they were given, and then, if necessary, they will be given the opportunity for a reaction. Then we will proceed to questions from the crowd. After that, we will leave each candidate the opportunity for some short closing remarks. So enough out of me, let's begin with our opening remarks. The ambassador has been chosen to go first. Mr. Ambassador, you have 3 minutes.
One, okay. Well, thank you for letting me know I was chosen to be first. And it is a great honor to be here, part of the Yeshiva University faculty. I find it a center of Jewish excellence, a center of American excellence, and it's really a great pride that I've met here students of the first class, both in the Yeshiva U campus and here on the Stearns campus. So it's really a pleasure and honor. I want to also thank the student body of YU and Stearns College and all the sponsors for this evening. I find it very, very thrilling, very exciting, and on a personal note, it's kind of putting me back on an election mode. So if I ever want to go back to politics, this is a good practice. So thank you for supplying and providing this for me. The question was Zionism. You know, simply put, Zionism is the national movement of the Jewish people to return to their land. But Zionism holds a much deeper philosophical, ideological, religious, ethnical, it goes to the core of Jewish history, Jewish genetics, and also, I would say, the Jewish future. So Zionism is the return to Zion. Zion, the biblical name of Israel, which is the homeland of the Jewish people, a land which was denied from the Jewish people for 2,000 years, although it is very important to mention that there was always an uninterrupted Jewish presence in our homeland. 1865, by all reports, there was a Jewish majority. Certainly was a Jewish majority in Jerusalem. So this is something that we have to remember very well. So Zionism, you can say, once Israel was re-established back in 1948 in a modern Jewish state, actually linking it back to 3,000 years of sovereignty since King David established sovereignty over the city of David and Jerusalem, and indeed later on Judea and Samaria, you would say this is the end of the Zionism purpose. Well, not at all, because Zionism is not only was to create the state of Israel, but also to make sure its safety, security, its well-being. This is not just to do it towards outside forces, but also to continue and rebuild our nation in a way which will be moral, equal, just society, society which will be also compassionate, which will be based on excellence, on tikkun olam, on achievements for all mankind. Have we achieved it? No, we're only halfway there. There are many great challenges for the security of Israel, for the legitimization of Israel, for the sovereignty of Israel from the outside, and there are many great challenges from the inside about more equitable and more equal society, bring the periphery to the center, and having a much more seamless society where there is unity without uniformity. Jewish pluralism has always been very, very important to us.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We're going to move to the next panelist, Mr. HaKohen. Opening statements. You have 3 minutes.
Sure. If we look at the situation, if we compare the situation of the Jewish people 150 years ago to the situation of the Jewish people today, I think to say that situation is radically different would be an understatement. I think in the past century and a half, we've achieved something that no other people in history has achieved. There's no other nation in history that was broken and scattered throughout the world yet managed to reunite in their historic homeland after thousands of years. There's no other people I know of who had managed to revive a dead language, something that even Herzl didn't think we'd be able to do. We essentially achieved the impossible. We ingathered exiles from the four corners of the world. We revived the dead language to everyday use. We liberated our homeland from British occupation, which we're not the only people who've done that, but if you know what Jews were 60, 70 years ago, I think it's remarkable. And we made a desert bloom. And we achieved all of those things through a very particularist, very necessary but very particularist, narrow Jewish nationalism that I would call Zionism. And for the sake of this evening's event, I think I'm going to call that Zionism, this narrow, particularist Jewish nationalism that accomplished all the things that we've accomplished so far. And I'd even go as far as to say, as Zionism is probably the most successful revolutionary movement in human history. But it's over. We are now post-Zionist. And in order for the Jewish people to advance to the next stage of achieving our historic aspirations, we need to shift from a particularist Jewish nationalism towards a uniquely Hebrew universalism. A uniquely Hebrew universalism that's more inclusive to other people in our society and actually concentrates not just on our own security, but actually on what we have to give to the rest of the world.
Start going in a minute.
Sure, thank you. Now, if any of us were to go back in time, 200 years, anywhere in the world, Morocco, Baghdad, Poland, the Ukraine, and speak to a rabbi, and tell that rabbi that one day soon, there will be a Jewish state in Palestine. They'll all speak Hebrew. The army will function in Hebrew, the government, the school system, everything will be in Hebrew. We'll have an army that wins wars against nearly impossible odds. Jerusalem will be the Torah capital of the world. That rabbi will believe you, but he'll only believe you because he has a mitzvah to believe you. It's an act of faith, and he'll have to work hard on himself to believe that this could be just like if I were to tell you right now the dead will rise, you have a mitzvah to believe me, but it'll be difficult. And as hard as it would be for you to believe that the dead will rise, it would be even more hard for that rabbi 200 years ago to believe that you could have a Jewish state in Palestine. So we are living in a generation where faith meets reality, and we have an obligation to decide for ourselves what is next and where we see ourselves as individuals and as a collective in achieving what's next.
Thank you, Mr. HaKohen. Mr. Benami.
Thank you very much, Yaacov, and I want to thank all of the groups here at Yeshiva College and all of the panelists for making this evening possible. I think it's a very exciting opportunity to share ideas and to debate, and so I appreciate the invitation and welcome the collegiality and the spirit of this evening. I think the question of where we are in Zionism is extraordinarily interesting, and I find it personally, in terms of my family history, very, very relevant. I often talk about my Zionism in terms of my family history, and I believe that we as a Jewish people have an ever-evolving narrative and history in which each generation is writing a chapter. There have been dozens and dozens of chapters behind us. There will be dozens and dozens of chapters to go, and each one of us has a responsibility to manage and do the best we can in the chapter that we are a part of. So Zionism today is for me just, the chapter of a longer story. My great-grandparents were part of the very first wave of Aliyah in 1882 that came from Russia. And I call that chapter of Zionism that they were part of the pioneers of Zionism. They went against long odds and traveled from Russia with maybe 20,000 other people over 20 years to try to fulfill the vision that Danny laid out of creating this land of our people in a place that our people had been connected to for 2,000 years. And then my grandparents were one of the founding families of Tel Aviv. There were 60 families who stood on a sand dune and drew lots and said, here we're going to build the first modern Hebrew city. And that generation was part that I call the builders of Zionism. And they created the cities, and they drained the swamps, and they made the desert bloom. And it's an amazing miracle what has come to be in the land of Israel as the state of Israel. And that generation, I believe, was followed by a generation whose role was to fight. They had to repel those who sought to destroy what had been built. They had to fight and defend the land against the armies and the neighbors who said that you don't belong here. And so that generation was my father's generation. My father was a commander in the Irgun, and he was on the Altalena when it was sunk off of Tel Aviv. In fact, he bought the boat and many of the arms that were on it. And that generation and the generation that had to defend the land in 48 and 67 and 73, they are the fighters. So the question to me is, what is the role of this generation in Zionism? What is my role in my family's saga and the saga of the Jewish people? I say that the role of this generation is to help to fulfill the vision of the generations that came before. Our role is to make peace with our neighbors, to establish the borders of the state of Israel so that those borders are recognized by the other countries of the region and by the entirety of the international community. Today, the international community can't draw the borders of the state of Israel on a map. Without those borders, the vision and the dream of my great-grandparents in Russia, my grandparents on the dunes of Tel Aviv, my father fighting in 1948, that vision cannot be fulfilled. So to me, Zionism today, the work of this generation, is to bring the conflict with the other people who live in that land to an end, draw the clear borders of the state of Israel, and have it accepted and recognized not only by our neighbors, but by the international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ben-Ami. Moving on to the first question of the evening. Question is, to what extent would you say it's legitimate for supporters of the state of Israel in the diaspora to publicly criticize Israeli government policies? Where do you see the limits of such criticisms? And at what point should the critic no longer be considered pro-Israel? Mr. Ben-Ami, you've been chosen to go first. You have 3 minutes.
I define, as it might not surprise many of you, that pro-Israel tent fairly broadly. The criteria to me are, do you recognize the right of the Jewish people to a nation state of their own like all other peoples in the world? Do you recognize the right of Zionism to, in fact, exist and to create the state of Israel? Do you recognize the right of the Jewish people to defend themselves in that state? To many of my friends who are looking to further the rights of the Palestinian people to a state of their own, I say to them, to be pro-Israel doesn't mean to me that I have to be anti-Palestinian. I don't have to deny your rights. You too have national rights that need to be fulfilled, but I will not recognize your rights and work with you to fulfill them unless you recognize my rights. And so that's what I say to those with whom I debate about the limits of the pro-Israel tent. I will not recognize you as pro-Israel or as part of my tent if you don't recognize the right of the Jewish people to a state of their own. If within that tent where you recognize those rights, you then have a critique about the policy of the government of the state of Israel when it comes to settlements, when it comes to the borders, when it comes to the treatment of minorities, if those are criticisms that you have within the context of accepting the right of the Jewish people to a state of their own, to me, that's legitimate criticism and should be welcomed and entertained within a democratic vision of what our state of Israel should be and what our pro-Israel community should be. So that's the extent, to me, of who should not be considered to be in the pro-Israel tent.
Thank you, Mr. Ben-Ami. We're going to move to the ambassador. So same question, just to reiterate.
Yes, Thank you. But first, let me just, I beg to differ with Mr. HaKohen about the need to redefine Zionism. Zionism is Zionism is Zionism. We don't need to reinvent ourselves. Just like you don't need to redefine what is Americanism, just like you don't need to find what is Judaism, you don't need to find what is Zionism. I mean, there is some adaptations to reality, but we don't have to redefine Zionism in any stretch of the world. About peace, peace for Israel is not just a strategic choice, it's a moral obligation, but peace is not a piece of paper. And this is why the devil here is in the details. And this is why, when it comes to such issues of death and lives, for Israelis, for the Jewish people, for the state of Israel, I think it's important that any criticism on the government of Israel will come from within. I think it is quite accepted here that the Jewish state belongs to the entire Jewish people. But there is a division of labor. We're all responsible for the well-being and the security of the state. But while the Jews in Israel are vested with the responsibility to defend it physically, risking their lives, developing it economically and scientifically, they also have the responsibility to make the political decisions. With all due respects, Jews who do not live in Israel, their responsibility is with political support and advocacy. Now, I'm not saying that self-criticism is not permitted, as long as it is a way to crystallize what is our national security interests. But I do not need to invite any more lobbies to pressure the state of Israel on domestic issues, whether it's settlements or borders or refugees or Jerusalem, as I would not expect any outside forces, who are not within the American society to pressure America for that. We have enough detractors of the Jewish people from all over the world. We are outnumbered by 22 Arab countries, 57 Islamic countries, non-aligned, an automatic majority of 120 countries against us, and even our natural allies in Europe and here in the United States have some criticism. So I'm not saying that we cannot self-criticize ourselves, but to actively lobby and pressure the government, the democratically elected government of Israel, I think this is a red line.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and moving on to Mr. HaKohen.
Well, in response to the ambassador's criticism of my use of the term Zionism, I think it's really a semantic argument. And we can decide for ourselves whether or not the state of Israel was the goal of Zionism or whether it's a tool with which to achieve the goals of Zionism. And for the sake of answering this question, I think I'm going to accept the ambassador's definition of the term Zionism. I'll say Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And I would differentiate between Jews in the United States or anywhere in the diaspora who regard themselves as pro-Israel versus those who regard themselves as Zionists. I would say somebody who's pro-Israel likes and supports the state of Israel the same way they might like and support the New York Knicks. But a Zionist is not a fan or a supporter of Israel. A Zionist is Israel. He's a player on the team. He sees himself as a character in the story of the Jewish people, and he's a participant in history. And if you are a participant in history, you don't only have a right, you have an obligation to criticize when you see the state of Israel doing something that you feel is wrong. Right? And every government in the world today has problematic policies. The state of Israel is no different. And I think those policies should be brought to light, and they should be changed. I think the Jewish people collectively have a responsibility to be participants in the story of their people and to shape history, and that is part of your obligation, it's part of my obligation, that's why we're here, and therefore criticism of Israel is legitimate so long as it's coming from a place of believing in the rights of the Jewish people to self-determination in their historic homeland.
Thank you, Mr. HaKohen. We move on to the next question. So for question number 2, where do you see this generation in Jewish history? What national goals remain to be achieved? And what barriers do you see currently standing in the way of the Jewish people achieving these goals? Mr. HaKohen, yes, you've been chosen to go again. You have 3 minutes.
I actually identify twin goals. I think when you look at the Jewish people today, within a historical context, you see that the majority of things that Jewish people have wanted for thousands of years are either in our hands or within reach. Okay? And it's important for us to define what we want, because when we define what we want, we know what's negotiable. When I look at the goals of what the ambassador would call Zionism, let's say the Jewish liberation today, I see twin goals, and I think they're interconnected. Number one is political independence. Today we're not an independent country, and we have not been an independent country for a long time. When I talk about independence, I mean no longer taking money from the United States, no longer taking weapons from the United States, and no longer taking orders from the United States, becoming an independent country. And number two is peace. And when I talk about peace, I don't mean a piece of paper. I don't mean what we had with Egypt for 30 years. I don't shoot at you, you don't shoot at me. I mean unity. That Israel becomes an organic part of the Middle East. And the only way for Israel to become an organic part of the Middle East is to stop looking at Europe and European countries as our natural allies, but look at our neighbors, the other Semitic peoples, the other peoples in the Middle East as our natural allies. It's ridiculous that our soccer team competes with Spain and Germany and France when we should be competing with Bahrain and Egypt and Lebanon. It's ridiculous that we don't sit together with the other countries in the Middle East at the UN and vote as a bloc. It's ridiculous that we are not an organic part of the Middle East, and from our perspective, I can only focus on what Israel's doing wrong. And I hear this from every one of my Palestinian colleagues. It has nothing to do with territory. It has to do with the fact that Israel, or at least Israel's ruling class, does not want to be part of the Middle East. We don't want to be perceived as part of the Middle East. We want to be part of the West. And as long as we insist on being a Western implant in the Middle East, we're going to be seen as colonialist, and we shouldn't blame people who see us as colonialist and who fight us because we're colonialist. We have to embrace our authentic Semitic identity. We have to start to look at our neighbors as equals, and we have to work towards real peace, unity with the other peoples in the Middle East in order to march forward together.
Thank you, Mr. HaKohen. We're going to move on to Mr. Ben-Ami. So again, the same question. Where do you see this generation of Jewish history? What national goals are meant to be achieved? Where do we currently stand in achieving those goals?
Terrific. Well, I think I talked a little bit about the generational view, actually, in my opening remarks, so I perhaps had a preview of the questions ahead of time. So let me just say that in addition to my view of what the role of this generation is, I do think that at times there is a tendency to regard the greatest achievement of Zionism as behind us. That the attainment of independence, the attainment of a state, of our national homeland, the return, the revival of the Hebrew language, the things that have been accomplished as these wonderful accomplishments and the high points of Zionism, and that our role today is somehow to defend and protect what has already been achieved. And to me, that vision puts the best days behind us. It puts the high points and the pinnacles of the work of the Jewish people in the context of our national movement in the past. And I think that the real essence of Zionism is never being satisfied with where we're at, and always trying to improve and make it a better project. And so I think that the best days of Zionism must be ahead of us. They must be the articulation and the realization of the values and the principles and the beliefs of the Jewish people, and bringing them to life in a country of our own, and to show the rest of the world that in fact the principles that have guided us and allowed us to survive for the millennia as a people, and to keep our national identification as so many others lost theirs, that there is power and strength in bringing those to life, and that we can provide a model for the rest of the world. And so I think there is so much more ahead of us in this generation and moving forward for my kids and my grandchildren and for all of you and your children and the generations to come. And I think the challenge for Zionism is to always keep an eye on the future, and to say the best days of what we have to do are ahead of us, and how can we bring the principles on which we were raised and on which our people are grounded to life, and really make them truly a light unto the nations, that really do inspire other people and give them a model. I think we have a lot of work to do, I think it is completely legitimate to ask the question of, are we living up to the very principles and the values that we have articulated for ourselves as a people? Do we in fact treat other people the way we wouldn't want to be treated ourselves? Do we live up to the very essence of the code of our people? And if we aren't, then we have a lot of work still ahead of us as Zionists and as people who care deeply about the Jewish people in Israel. And that's, to me, the role of this generation.
Thank you, Mr. Ben-Ami. Next up is the ambassador.
Yes, I believe that the real challenge of our generation is to make sure we stay as one. We have the Jewish people of Israel, and of course there, our main goal is to be able to defend ourselves by ourselves, and not just the Jewish people in Israel, but all over. But I believe the challenge is far greater for you here, or in other Jewish communities worldwide, and that is Jewish continuity. Jewish continuity through Jewish identity, through Jewish education, and to make sure that we do not grow apart. So we will not become two peoples with one religion. And this is the real challenge of the time, and I think that national projects which go cross borders, like Taglit, Birthright, is something of major importance to bring Jews from all over the world to Israel, to reacquaint themselves with their land and with the people of Israel, and to make sure also that the people of Israel understand the challenges and the concerns of Jews worldwide. A major project of March of the Living is also very important. It brings together Jewish youth from all over the world to Auschwitz to understand the past and to make sure it will never happen again. But the pluralism that we see here in the United States, and conservative, reform, Orthodox, which we are not familiar in Israel. In Israel there is a monopoly, if you will, of the Rabbanut, and there is a real growing wedge between how people in Israel see what Judaism is and how people in the diaspora. I think there should be a better and a more fruitful dialogue, because I do believe that our destiny and our common well-being and security is intertwined. And God forbid, if the state of Israel's security or well-being is compromised, so is the well-being and security of every Jew in the world and every community in the world, and vice versa. So I believe the challenge of the time, and this is the leaders of Israel and the leaders of Jewish communities worldwide, in the United States, in France, in Ukraine, in Mexico, anywhere else, is to have a much better dialogue to understand that we are one and we're going to remain one.
So thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Just a quick announcement before we move on to the next question. There will be cards that will be passed around for the audience to ask questions that will be read out after the debate concludes. Stay in your seats. They will be passed around and handed back into the people that will be collecting them. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to the next question. So the personalized questions on the two-state solution. So first off, we're going to ask Mr. HaKohen. You're known to be an outspoken critic of the two-state solution that enjoys overwhelming support from the international community. But the very legitimacy of the State of Israel under international law is grounded under the UN partition plan that also calls for the establishment of an Arab state in Palestine. How do you justify the existence of a Jewish state while simultaneously rejecting the establishment of the Palestinian state demanded by the very same UN resolution? Mr. HaKohen, you have 3 minutes.
Well, first of all, Yaacov, I reject the assumption that we have a state because of General Assembly Resolution 181. First of all, it was a General Assembly resolution, not a Security Council resolution. It's a recommendation in its own language. It was rejected, and not only by the Arab parties, but also by the Jews, who successfully fought the British and forced them to flee our country. If in the British language, meaning according to British documents, they left Palestine because of Jewish terrorism, because of people like Mr. Ben-Ami's father, who were willing to fight and die until our country was free. And it's not because of any General Assembly resolution, and certainly they didn't send troops to enforce this resolution. It was only after Israel started winning that they sent Count Bernadotte to come and put a stop to our victories, and we killed him in Jerusalem. Now also, in terms of what the Palestinians want, I think that we have an obligation not only to decide according to Jewish history what it is that we want, what we're after. We have to understand what the Palestinians want. You see, the Jewish people and the Palestinian people are living in two completely different movies. We're living in two different realities, and we've experienced the last century very, very differently. In 1948, for example, was experienced differently by us and by the Palestinians, and everything that's happened since has been experienced very differently. Now, Palestinians, for the most part, politically active Palestinians, reject the idea of a two-state solution. They see it as a Zionist plot. When you talk to Palestinian activists on the street, they see the Oslo Accords and its derivatives as a Zionist scheme against them, just as many Jews, especially Jews in the territories, see the Oslo Accords and its derivatives as a plot against us, meaning both populations feel victimized by the same policies. And I think we need to determine what it is the Jewish people want, the Palestinians need to determine what it is that they want, and we need to try to create a bigger movie that's inclusive enough to encompass both ostensibly rival movies. Now, the concept of a nation state might be familiar to us because we're one of the only people on the planet who rule the same country, speak the same language, trade in the same currency, and celebrate the same festivals as we did 3,000 years ago.
1 minute.
But from the Palestinian perspective, and from the perspective of most Arabs throughout the Middle East, the nation state is seen as a European invention, it's a social construct, and it has nothing to do with their core aspirations. I think a flag, a state, is symbolic to many Palestinians, but I think that what most Palestinians are interested in is living in one democratic country between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, in which they enjoy equal rights, complete equality, meaning the same access to water, the same access to electricity, the same access to the political process, the same employment opportunities, the same freedom of movement as every Jew. And what we need is to experience the state of Israel as the fulfillment of our historic aspirations for thousands of years. We need to experience it as the restoration of what the Romans took away from us. And I think we need to look for a solution that allows both people not to compromise and get half of what they want, but for both people to get exactly what they want.
And so thank you, Mr. HaKohen. We're going to move on to the question for the ambassador. So as a former member of the Israeli government that was extensively involved in the peace process with the Palestinian Authority, how would you respond to the accusation that the current Palestinian leadership are not true partners for peace, as they continue to incite hatred in the Arab media, like when President Abbas just recently reaffirmed, just a few days ago, that he will not recognize Israel as a Jewish state, nor will he ever accept a small portion of Israeli annexed East Jerusalem as a Palestinian capital. Mr. Ambassador, you have 3 minutes.
Well, I think you just gave the answer, whether we have a partner or not. And I would say that with all due respect to this current Palestinian leadership, I don't see any difference in their ideology nor in their tactics compared to successive and historic Palestinian leaders who have more than wanted to build their own nation, wanted to destroy ours. Otherwise, I cannot explain why they wouldn't take the Peel Commission in 1936, the partition of 1947, Ehud Barak's offer in 2000, Ehud Olmert's offer in Annapolis, so forth and so on. So we do have a problem here, which is not territorial, unfortunately, but it's existential. It's ideological. They turn it to be also a religion, so we certainly have a problem. Now let me go back to the definition of Zionism, which is really the rebuilding of our nation state in our homeland, but also part of it is keeping the Jewish state Jewish and democratic. And in order to keep the Jewish state both Jewish and democratic and thriving, a political and a physical separation from the Palestinians is imperative. It is imperative as we see it as a trend all over the world. If we see here the mega trend, we see here a political disintegration. It's not just in the Middle East, not just in the Sudan and North Sudan. We see it in the heart of Europe. Czechoslovakia was broken. Yugoslavia was broken to the 6 different nations. Not to mention the Soviet Union. The Scots are going in 2 months from now to a referendum whether to secede from England, the Catalonians in Spain, and so on and so forth. So we cannot put together artificially 2 peoples, certainly not with the emotions and the history that is involved. This is why I believe that the government of Israel on both sides, by the way, whether it's from the left or on the right, have acquiesced to a two-state solutions. But this is not the end. It's two states for two peoples. Ariel Sharon in 2003, when he accepted the roadmap for peace, the title was Two States for Two Peoples. For some reason, the two peoples have disappeared. You ask the Palestinians, 2 states for 2 people, they will not mention 2 peoples, even if you really torture them. And this is the main problem. Do we talk about 2-state solution? What does it mean? 2 Palestinian states? No, we want one Jewish state which can defend itself by itself. And this is where the details are important. And the details are important not only on security, presence of Israel in the Jordan Valley, which will be, I think, also imperative for the security and well-being of Jordan and the Palestinian Authority, as we are the only force to keep away terror organizations like Hamas or Global Jihad to take over the Palestinian Authority, as in Ramallah, as they did in Gaza only 7 years ago. And it is also very imperative that the Palestinians will recognize Israel as the nation homeland of the Jewish people, Israel as a Jewish state. And I don't need them to reaffirm who I am. I don't need the Palestinians to say Israel is a Jewish state in Hebrew, not even in English. They must say it in Arabic, because that would be the real manifestation of the end of claims and the end of conflict. And the Palestinians will tell you, well, why do you impose this on us and you didn't ask the Egyptians or the Jordanians in the peace treaty to say Israel is a Jewish state? And the answer is, neither Egypt nor Jordan claim the Negev, the Galilee, Tel Aviv, Haifa, or my homeland, or my hometown in Hod HaSharon. This is the difference, and this is imperative for them to accept it if we want to see a real peace and not just a piece of paper.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. So moving on to the personalized question to Mr. Ben-Ami. How would you respond to the accusation that by lobbying the United States government to actively pressure Israeli and Palestinian leaders to accept a policy that conflicts with the will of their respective peoples on the ground, Yeshiva is actually promoting imperialism in the Middle East and weakening organic democracy?
So first of all, let me just say, how surprised I am to agree so much with Ambassador Ayalon. I think that the question of mutual recognition of the need for both peoples to recognize the legitimacy and the right of the other people to a national home, and for that to be the end of this conflict and to physically separate, I couldn't agree more. It's the entire raison d'etre of J Street. It's our belief that that is an existential necessity of Israel and that it's an absolute requirement of Zionism. And so I'm very pleased to hear a ringing endorsement of that, and I don't think we're actually very far apart on the question of recognition. I think the phrase Jewish state sometimes provides a linguistic problem, and I think the longer terminology of state of the Jewish people and a state of the Palestinian people and states that guarantee the rights of minorities who live there and are citizens, all of that becomes a paragraph that I believe actually can be negotiated. So getting to the question you asked me, the personalized question, it is a little bit strange to call it imperialism, to suggest that when two parties who have an intractable conflict that has deep emotions, that grows out of fear, that grows out of violence, that grows out of a mutual sense of victimhood and a sense that, we have suffered more than you, no, we have suffered more than you. Those two people find it very, very difficult to sit across a table from each other as equals and start to bargain and to trade off what they are willing to give each other in a negotiation, the way that two commercial partners might be willing to do so. And people have studied conflict resolution over the decades and have come to the conclusion that to resolve conflicts of this depth and of this intensity, that have had violence and emotion and tragedy, that you can use outside help. If you have a very, very messy divorce and an emotional situation between a husband and a wife, you put them sometimes in separate rooms and you have a negotiator go back and forth, a mediator, to try to figure out how do you work this out. And that's what's needed here. And the United States can play that role. The United States can be a broker in the negotiations to help to resolve this conflict, to figure out what the two sides are willing to give, what their bottom lines are, what compromises can be. reached, and that's the role that J Street wants the United States to play. To be a broker, to be a mediator, to help. True friendship for Israel from the United States is to help this conflict end, to achieve that two-state solution that Ambassador Ayalon has said is an existential necessity for Israel to be both Jewish and democratic. And that's what we lobby the United States to do.
Thank you, Mr. Ben-Ami. Since we're a bit ahead of time, we're going to give the opportunity to, I guess, if any of you have any disagreements with what has just been stated. Does anyone want to respond to any of the claims made by each of our panelists? So the next question and the final question before we move on to questions from the audience is each panelist will have the opportunity to question each of their co-panelists. It could be a separate question, it could be the same question, doesn't matter, whichever panelist chooses. So Mr. Ambassador, you've been chosen to go first. We ask the same question.
Okay, that will be a simultaneous question, I guess, for both Yehuda and Jeremy. And probably you're coming from opposing sides. It would be interesting to hear your answer. And the question is about settlements. And the question is, do you see and why settlements as an obstacle to peace? And why would you, if at all, single out this issue to pressure Israel, given the history that the PLO was created before settlements were ever created, 1965, given the fact that there was no peace before settlements were ever put there, either in Gaza or in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank, given the fact that Israel has given up in a very emotional and, I would say, excruciatingly painful national exercise of uprooting and removing 8,500 Jews, evicting them from Gaza, 3 generations of Jews, which did not give any peace. So why would you, or wouldn't you maybe, zero on settlements and ask of Israel any concessions on settlements, as there is no reciprocal concession from the Palestinians, whether it's in the issue of refugees, the issues of Jewish recognition, or issues of Jerusalem. So do you see it fair, logical, and constructive for peace, encouraging the Palestinians to make concessions by putting all the onus of the settlements on Israel?
So Mr. Benham, you may respond first.
So let me say that I think that the underlying problem is not settlements. The underlying problem, and I articulated in the opening, is the lack of a border. That ultimately what ensures the Jewish and democratic nature of the state of Israel is a border in which you have a majority of Jews that is going to be a majority for the foreseeable future. And across that border is enough land for a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. I think that's an existential necessity. So I sort of flip the question on its head, and I say if one acknowledges that there has to be a border, and one acknowledges that there has to be a Palestinian state across that border, and most likely you have to acknowledge that that Palestinian state is going to make up a fair percentage of what is today called the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. Maybe it's 93%, maybe it's 95%, maybe it's 97%, the exact percentage is to be defined. Why would one continue to build in that 93%? Why would one continue, if there is to be a Palestinian state, would it not be in the self-interest of the state of Israel? Would it not be in the interest of showing good faith and goodwill as the power that is in control and the party that has the power at the moment? Wouldn't it be a sign of good faith to voluntarily say we will not build anymore, we will not waste Israeli taxpayer money by building buildings that, if we're serious about peace, will ultimately have to come down on the other side of today's barrier? Maybe that barrier won't be the border, but I'd say that's the outside of where the border is likely to be. I don't think that they're going to accept a state that is less than where the barrier is today. It's going to probably require moving the border, the barrier, a little bit more towards the green line rather than away. So why build beyond? I'm not saying that is the be-all and end-all and the root of this conflict. The root of this conflict is two peoples want the same land. And that goes back to the time, before the State of Israel. That goes back to the birth of nationalism for the Jews and for the Palestinians in the 130 years ago. And that's the root of this conflict. It's not settlements. But I flip the question on its head and I just ask, why would a government of the State of Israel that is serious about a two-state solution and understands what Ambassador Ayalon just said, which is that the entirety of this project is at risk without a Palestinian state, without a two-state solution, everything we're talking about comes to an end. Why would you continue building on land that you're ultimately going to have to give up? So I'm not saying that's the be-all and end-all problem. I just flip it around and ask that question to Ambassador Ayalon.
To answer Mr. Ben-Ami's last question to Ayalon, I'm going to jump in if that's all right with the ambassador. I think the answer is because it's our homeland. I have a problem with the word settlement, because I think the implication in English, and I think a lot of Israelis don't understand this, a lot of Israelis who I live in Beit El don't understand this, that in English the words settler and settlement have a connotation of being colonialist, right? As opposed to mitnachel, which comes from the root word nachala, which actually infers that we're indigenous. In English, the word actually infers we're colonialist. So I have a problem with the word. But the Jews in Judea are not the Americans in Afghanistan. Judea is our homeland. Binyamin is our homeland. Samaria is our homeland. It's where we're from. It's the cradle of Jewish civilization. The problem is that we behave like the Americans in Afghanistan. Checkpoints, walls, restrictions on freedom of movement, forcing millions of people to live under a military bureaucracy. This is the way Western powers behave when they occupy developing countries. The Jewish people have every right to live and to build and to be sovereign in the territories liberated in 1967. The question is, how are we there? And I would argue that Israel's military occupation of the West Bank actually undermines the Jewish people's legitimate rights to Judea and Samaria. So it's not a question of building Jewish homes, it's a question of how the Palestinians are experiencing not only those Jewish homes being built, but also the checkpoints, also the walls, also the restrictions on freedom of movement, and all of these things are the results of the Oslo Accords. Prior to the early 90s, there weren't checkpoints and walls. Palestinians from Beit Lechem could work in Tel Aviv. Jews from Beit El could shop in Ramallah. Everybody could stop in Jericho for ice cream on their way to the Dead Sea. We lived together in one country. Things were not perfect, but they were a lot closer to perfect than they are today. The last 20 years, the Oslo Accords and all its derivatives has forcibly segregated two populations. We barely see each other anymore. The new generation of Palestinians don't know Hebrew, and most of them haven't even seen the Mediterranean Sea.
1 minute.
And you can't blame a person, meaning we can talk about the education Palestinians are getting in the schools, and I think most people in this room have seen on YouTube the education Palestinians get in their schools, or incitement on television. But the question we're not asking is how we reinforce that education every time a Palestinian child has to travel from his home to his school and go through an Israeli checkpoint, and have Israeli soldiers controlling everything about his life, his grandmother's life, his sister's life, his friends' lives. A Jew in New York, a Jew in Netanya, or in Hod HaSharon can live his life ignoring the conflict. He can think about sports, girls, grades, university. A 16-year-old Palestinian in Jenin does not have this luxury. Everything is the conflict because he's experiencing an occupation every day. This doesn't mean pull the Jews out, but it means define for ourselves what we're doing in the territories. Who are we? And how are we going to make the future work together?
Thank you, Mr. HaKohen. Mr. Ben-Ami, you'll have the opportunity to ask any of your co-panelists a question.
Yes.
Sure.
Sorry?
I thought you flipped the question to me, no, about settlements?
No, I'm about to do that.
So I'd ask each a separate question. I'd ask first to Ambassador Ayalon, why build in areas that are going to be part of a Palestinian state? If you do believe that there must be a Palestinian state, why would you do that? It makes no sense, number one.
So let's allow Mr. Ambassador to answer, and then after he answers, you can ask the question to Mr. HaKohen.
Okay, this is a very good, legitimate question. I think that Yehuda HaKohen gave the ideological, the passionate answer to this, which I wholeheartedly agree, except I will give a practical one, which is, why build there? Because people live there. There are 700,000 Jews who live there, and until and unless there is a settlement, you cannot just infringe with their lives. Are you going to ask for young couples in Bet El or Ofra not to have children, so they cannot add a room, or can add a balcony, or can add a kindergarten? This is what we're talking about. Every little building, whether it's in Jerusalem, the eastern side of Jerusalem, or anywhere else, is becoming a world crisis. And this is the real problem. The real problem here is that we're getting on both sides. Israel today, this current Israeli government, is not building in the territories. I mean, there are some very, very small projects of just keeping and maintaining lives and keeping up with the natural growth. But the world pounds on every little building that we build, and this is why playing into the Palestinians' hands and actually making the Palestinians more incorrigible and more intransigent. So I would expect, and certainly from the Jewish community worldwide, to put the issue of the settlements aside. There is a reality there. There are 700,000 Jews who live there everywhere, and they have the right to have roads, to have kindergartens, to have schools, and to add a balcony to their home if they want to. This is the issue, and this is what the Palestinians are against, including in Jerusalem. This is number one, and this is not mutually exclusive to the fact that at some point in the future, once we have a political settlement, we have proven in the past in Gaza that the settlements are not an obstacle to peace, and these are reversible in areas where the democratically elected government of Israel, and whether they send it to a referendum or not, it doesn't matter. If the people of Israel decide that they are leaving behind land, the issue of the settlements will just be self-evident. So this is not the issue right now. So anyone who puts the settlement is a pretext, is a way to really compromise Israel bargaining chips and bargaining positions. And this is where I will end, although I did say that it is important, it's imperative to keep Israel democratic and Jewish, and I think everybody in Israel, 75%, believe now in the two-state solutions for two peoples, as Israel is a Jewish state. The time is not of the essence. Anybody who says the time works against Israel is either naive or has an ulterior motive to push politically Israel into compromises that Israel cannot afford. We have seen in the past 65 years that the time has not really worked against us. Time works for those who prepare themselves for the challenges. And this is why I can wait. And the Jewish people and the state of Israel can wait. And if the Palestinians will not compromise on the essential issues, we can wait, and nobody can force any solution on us that will really jeopardize our life, our future, and Jewish continuity in our land.
So thank you, Mr. Master. Mr. Benjamin, you may ask the question to Yehuda. Again, we're going to ask to please limit the applause until after the debate.
Unless you want to applaud me, which is going to be very rare, so you can do it if you'd like. Thank you very much. So it's good to see that we found an area of disagreement, because it was a little bit too cordial, so I'm looking forward to continuing that piece. So my question for Yehuda HaKohen is, if the concept of Jewish sovereignty, of having a Jewish homeland and the Jewish connection to the Jewish home, that is, I will acknowledge that the Jewish home rests in Judea and Samaria and rests in those areas more than in my grandparents' home in Tel Aviv. How is it that that can be reconciled with maintaining democracy? If you have 12 million people today living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and about 6 million of them are Jewish and 6 million are not Jewish, and over the course of the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, there will be more non-Jews than Jews in that land, how can you have a democracy and respect the rights of all, as you seem to want to do, and at the same time hope that there will continue to be some element of Jewishness to the country that provides the vote and equal rights in a non-Jewish setting.
So you have 3 minutes, Mr. Yaacov.
I'll do my best. First of all, I think, Mr. Ben-Ami, you're alluding to what people commonly call a demographic threat. And I personally have a moral problem with this term demographic threat because I think it's inherently racist, and I think it would be considered racist in any political discourse other than the discourse we're having, and I think it's only considered acceptable in this discourse because it's being used as a weapon to force Israel into compromises that are not really in our interest. Now,
you'll acknowledge that I didn't use the phrase.
I acknowledge that you did not use
You're
the phrase.
putting that-
Not only do I acknowledge, I applaud the fact that you
Right,
didn't
no,
use the
and
phrase.
I don't use that phrase, and I think it is a vile phrase, and I want to make sure you're clear that that's not what I'm saying.
Okay, I appreciate the clarification. If you had said demographic threat, I would have told you that the real demographic threat between the Mediterranean and the Jordan is not the Arab population, it's the Haredi population. The Haredim are the fastest growing population between the river and the sea. Number 2 are people like myself. And number 3 is the Arab population, and number 4 are people like the ambassador. If you look at the school systems in Israel today, there are secular public schools, there are religious public schools, there are Arab language schools, there are Haredi schools, and the smallest classrooms, when you look at first graders and second graders, are usually the secular public schools. I mean, 20 years from now, Israel really will be a religious Middle Eastern country with nuclear weapons, and the silver lining to that cloud is that we'll have a much easier time fitting in with our neighbors. Peace will be easier, Mr. Ben-Ami. Now, in terms of your question regarding democracy, I want democracy. I'd like to see Israel become more of a democracy. I was in Israel in 2005 during the expulsion of Jews from Gush Katif. I don't think Israel was behaving like a democratic country, and I could go through, if I had more than 3 minutes, I'd go through an entire laundry list of things that were anti-democratic in 2005. But for me, a Jewish state is not defined by a majority Jews. And I think this is a question we have to ask ourselves. What makes a state Jewish? Because we're accepting without even questioning what makes a state Jewish, we're accepting a Jewish majority. I think a Jewish state means a state that expresses Jewish values. And one of those values is participatory democracy, not representative democracy. I think one of those values is how you treat a non-Jew in a Jewish society. And right now, we are not treating non-Jews in our society according to what I consider to be Jewish values. Today, there are Jewish men and women all over the world who have daughters and name her Yael.
Mr. Yaacov, you have a minute.
Yael was a non-Jewish woman living in our country who is a hero of Jewish history. And I think one of the problems is that while we were in exile, we kind of divided people into 2 categories. There were Jews and there were Gentiles. And for the most part, we saw the Gentiles as the oppressor, as the enemy. But now that we're back in our homeland and now that we're back in a position of power, we have to realize that there are more than 2 categories of people. And when you look at the non-Jew living in our society, there are different categories of what a non-Jew can be. There's Ben Noach, there's a Ger Toshav, there's Amalek. These are 3 very different categories of people. Just like there are Kohanim and Levi'im and Yisraelim and different tribes of Israel. And I think that we need to, part of this shift from Jewish nationalism to Hebrew universalism is to dig deeper into our culture, dig deeper into our sources, and find ways, policies, to make our country simultaneously more Jewish and more democratic and more universalist and more inclusive, so the non-Jew in our society and the Haredim in our society, since we're on the subject, feel more comfortable participating in that society. And that's our challenge today.
Thank you, Mr. HaKohen. Now you are up to ask any question to your co-panelists. It could be a different question again, it could be the same question.
Okay, well, my question for Mr. Ambassador Ayalon is, if you define Zionism the way you do, as the Jewish national movement, and you talk about our rights to Samaria and Judea the way you do you not see it as a betrayal of Jewish history, as a betrayal of everything the Jewish people have wanted for thousands of years, to be willing to compromise on the cradle of Jewish civilization, on places like Hebron and Beit Lechem and Beit El and Shiloh and Shechem and Yerushalayim?
Mr. Ambassador, you have 3 minutes to respond.
Well, I don't think that we should ever give up this really cradle of Jewish life. And I don't think that this is mutually exclusive to have a Palestinian state and still keep all these issues. This is all these places which are so dear to us and will always be dear to us. And I said Zionism is just not a national movement. This is, of course, I would say the dictionary definition. Zionism today is defending and protecting the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And that is against a military threat, against economic threats, and against political threats, which we see today with the BDS and with the delegitimization campaign. Now, we do have our national dreams, which we will never give them up. As a politician, as a leader, I also have to be pragmatic and also to understand that the Palestinians, whether they're right or wrong, also they have their own narrative, which is completely false. But this is a narrative that we have to contend with. And I think that leaders on both sides, the real, I would say, unforgiving, maybe, role of a leader is to be the bridge, to bridge the gap between the national, legitimate national aspirations and reality. So if I had it my own way, I think we would have returned to the biblical borders. Is it possible? Probably not in our time. So that's why we have to be pragmatic. We have to make sure that our values, that our interests are protected for the duration. And this is what we need to do.
To Mr. Ben-Ami, a similar question. If the last 20 years has only really been a disaster for not only the Jewish people, but also the Palestinian people, meaning the Palestinians, as a result of the Oslo Accords, have to deal with checkpoints, walls, and restrictions on freedom of movement. The Jews, as a result of the Oslo Accords, have to deal with politically motivated house demolitions, the destruction of entire communities, negation of our national rights throughout the world, and the shrinking of our borders. And we haven't succeeded in achieving peace. We've gotten a lot further away from peace than we were 20 years ago. And the Palestinian street is past the two-state solution, way past the two-state solution. I even have Palestinian friends who have spoken at the J Street conference to convince you that we should be looking towards a one-state solution. My question is why, or in whose interest is it, to continue to push this failed policy when all it's doing is hurting people? Palestinians and Jews.
So obviously I disagree with the premise of the question. What has failed over the last 20 years is the effort to finalize an agreement. Absolutely no question. I would argue that, in fact, we are a lot closer than we were 20 or 25 years ago to achieving it. Prior to 1988, I don't think more than a handful of Jews or Palestinians spoke about a two-state solution. I think if I had sat here in 1986, 1987 and talked about a two-state solution, I imagine I'm not too popular in the room today, but imagine how unpopular I would have been in 1986, 87, 88, before the PLO made the historic decision to recognize the State of Israel. And before the Madrid conference, and before Oslo, and the recognition of the path towards two states. And so I think we've made a tremendous amount of progress. Today, 80% of Jewish Americans support a two-state solution. Majorities of both Palestinian and Israelis support a two-state solution. I recognize there is a great deal of skepticism. Probably 80 to 90% of both publics don't believe it will ever happen. You probably both fall into that 80 to 90%, not believing it will ever happen. But I think there is a majority recognition that it is still the best of all possible outcomes. And the failure to get where we're going is not an excuse to stop trying. I am not a scholar. I am not a student of Judaism. But I do understand that it is taught to me that ours may not be to achieve, but we cannot desist from trying. And the goal...
Let me clarify the question. Are you willing to entertain an alternative solution?
No, because I think there's only two states of being here. One is one state, which is essentially maybe what we have now. I call that the problem. I don't call it a one-state, I never use the phrase one-state solution. I call it a one-state nightmare. Because what it is two people continuing to fight for generation after generation after generation and killing each other and watching their kids and their grandkids continue to kill each other because they both think they want all of the land. And that's sort of human nature. Or you separate into two states and you end the conflict and you draw a border and you say this is the end of claims and you're over here and we're over here. So I only see two possible states of play, the problem and the solution, the nightmare and the hope. I don't see an alternative solution, and I think those who only point out in the rearview mirror what has failed are not going to be successful in driving forward and leading us to a future that is worth living for our generations to come. And I think that the future is we need to keep on trying, and I will not argue that we have failed to achieve a two-state solution over the last 20 years. That is a fact. And there's a legacy of failure, and there's a legacy of suffering. The question is, how do we avoid another 20 years of failure and suffering and death and bloodshed? And I don't see the continued building beyond the barrier or a dream of somehow living together in peace in one land. I don't see how either of those are an answer to the fundamental existential challenge that faces Zionism in the generation to come.
Okay, thank you. So I guess that concludes the debate. Now we're going to move on to the personalized questions from the audience. We're going to go one by one. Each question, there's 3 questions for each panelist. There will be a minute or so to respond to each question. We're going to ask for the panelists to please be as precise as possible in the responses. So first to the ambassador. So you are known for your relationship with American politicians. What will you respond to Mr. HaKohen's remarks that American-Israeli relationship is not healthy?
I would vehemently disagree. I think Israel and the United States are natural allies, not based only on the values, not on the interests, not only the common threats, unfortunately, that we face, but also on the ethos, and also because of the great Jewish community here. I don't think that we will ever have a substitute for the United States, and I know now there's different scholastic talks about, well, maybe the decline of American power, withdrawal of America from the international scenes, maybe to look elsewhere into Russia or China. No way. We have nothing in common with these countries, only with the United States, and also because of the Jewish community here.
So Mr. HaKohen, would you like to clarify maybe some remarks that maybe the audience didn't understand concerning the relationship between America and Israel today?
Sure. I think that most nations in the world define their interests and then they make alliances based on those interests. The state of Israel is the only country I know of, there could be others, but it's the only country I know of that first decides who it wants to be friends with and then tries to recreate its interests around that relationship. If the Jewish people have dreamed about a return to the land of Israel, a return to Judea and Samaria, a return to Jerusalem, a return to Gaza, for thousands of years. And the United States has consistently worked to pressure Israel to give up those territories. And prior to the Six-Day War, the United States was pressuring Israel to give up the Negev. And in 1948, the United States imposed an embargo that prevented us from getting arms while the British were arming, training, and leading Arab armies into war with us. The United States can be a great country, maybe it's on the decline, we'll see. And it could be a great ally. But right now the relationship is abusive, and I think in any abusive relationship, the abused partner has to be willing to walk out the door in order for the relationship to ever become healthy.
Thank you, Mr. HaKohen. Sorry. We're going to move on to the next questions for Mr. Ben-Ami. The question is, why create a separate lobbyist group when we have a successful lobbying group in AIPAC which unites liberals and conservatives? You have a minute to respond.
I see the mission of J Street as providing a voice in Washington, D.C. and in the American Jewish community for Jews and others who care deeply about Israel in this country and who believe that a two-state solution is existential. We formed J Street because we didn't believe that that was the message that any other organization was bringing in a political context or in a lobbying context or into the communal conversation. But within the American Jewish community of 6 million people, there are a very, very large number of people who think the way that I do, and our voice in a democracy in this country has a right and it deserves to be heard without any disrespect to any other group, but simply because we have a difference and an alternative voice that we believe needed to be heard both in Washington and in the Jewish community.
Thank you, Mr. Ben-Ami. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next question. This one's from Mr. HaKohen. So, Mr. HaKohen, you mentioned that Israel needs to stop. Wow, it's really good handwriting. Thank you. You mentioned that Israel needs. You mentioned that Israel needs to stop associating with the West and start working with the Middle Eastern countries, like with our soccer team, for example. Hopefully, that's not the limit. I guess in your opinion. But as a democratic, advanced country, how do you think it's possible for Israel to blend in the Middle East?
I think that, again, this comes back to the fundamental question of what the Jewish people want and what the Jewish people have wanted for thousands of years. Okay? Now, 300 years ago, Jews in ghettos all over the world weren't dreaming of the day when we'd have a booming high-tech sector. I think it's great that we have a booming high-tech sector, but I don't think this addresses a fundamental yearning of the Jewish people throughout time. I don't think we've yearned to be the Robin to America's Batman in the Middle East, which puts us at odds with all the other peoples in the Middle East, to be viewed as a Western satellite or a colonialist fortress in the region. I think we have to be very clear about what the Jewish people want. And I think at the bare minimum, when I look at the itch that the state of Israel scratches in Jewish history, it's really to restore everything that the Romans took from us. When people ask me, when Palestinians ask me, what is it that you want? What do the Jewish people want? I say, I want everything the Romans took from us. That's what I want. That's my position. I want the things that I say 3 times a day in the Shemona Esrei. Right? I want a return to our homeland. I want the restoration of justice. I want the building of Jerusalem. I want peace. These are the things I want, and these are the things that we're fighting for. And right now, we can't fight for them if we insist on being a Western satellite in the Middle East, which prohibits our ability to be ourselves. Anybody who takes a walk from the old city of Jerusalem to the central bus station knows that Israel is not a Western country. The problem isn't that Israel is a Western country, and I'm saying we shouldn't be. The problem is Israel is not a Western country. Israel is a very Middle Eastern country. Anybody who's spent significant time there knows this, but we're a Middle Eastern country trying to be Western and making a fool of ourselves in the process.
Thank you, Mr. HaKohen. We're going to move to the next question for the ambassador. So this question is, what is your opinion on members of the Jewish community who support BDS? Should we exclude them from our broader Jewish circles?
I think we should certainly embrace them and keep them very close. They say, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I think it's not legitimate for anyone to call BDS on Israel, the only democratic country in the Middle East. And certainly I would not expect the Jewish community or any member of the Jewish community to go against their own people.
Are you saying that if they support BDS, they are our enemies, or they are still our friends, but we still need to keep them closer?
We have to keep them very close and convince them to do not to do that, because what they do, I think, is they make pretty much a mockery of themselves, I believe. You see, we have detractors, as I mentioned. We're outnumbered. 22 Arab countries, I mentioned it before, 57. So to have also members of the Jewish community turn against our own interests, to me, is something which is illogical, it's immoral, and quite honestly, it's quite stupid. Quite stupid. I mean, we can have our own debate, and I'm not against self-criticism. They can criticize as much as they can. But to put the pressure on Israel is just totally unacceptable. We don't need anyone to teach us what to do for peace. Nobody wants peace more than Israelis. We are the ones who are bearing the cost of not having peace, of not having, as Jeremy said, filed borders. We do want our secure and recognized defensible borders. This is also what UN Security Council 242 is calling for, and unfortunately we have not seen reciprocity on that from the Arab side. So for anyone to push Israel is unacceptable, totally unacceptable. And also, just to my friend Yehuda here, I would say that before you are looking for any other allies, whether it's Russia or China, look into the UN record. If you see what the Chinese and Russians subscribed on, resolutions that would actually bring about the end of Israel, you would think twice. And the only reason we have resolutions, Security Council resolutions, that are not anti-Israel is because of the United States. And the United States is not doing it just because of the friendship and morality. They also do it for their own very vital interests. So this is a natural alliance and will continue to be this way.
So Mr. HaKohen, if you had 30 seconds, how would you respond to the ambassador's accusation?
Well, first of all, I'd say I prefer to, I prefer to die on my feet than live on my knees. And I don't like this situation where Israel behaves as a vassal state to the United States. As you pointed out, the Americans have interests in vetoing anti-Israel resolutions, and those interests are often just a means of controlling us. I think that I never suggested we should be shifting our vassalhood to China or to Russia. I think Israel should be an independent country, and I think our natural allies are actually the other indigenous peoples in the Middle East, including the Kurds. I hope we see a free Kurdistan very soon. I'd like to see other peoples in the Middle East who don't enjoy self-determination achieve self-determination, and I'd like to see a Middle East that's actually neutral, that's unified and neutral from the rivalries between the United States, China, and Russia.
Thank you, Mr. HaKohen. We're going to move to the next question for Mr. Ben-Ami. So this question states, J Street often works with SJP, so Student Justice for Palestine, that is known for their anti-Semitism and denial of the existence of the State of Israel. To what extent is J Street willing to work with the Palestinians?
We're absolutely willing to work with the Palestinians. The question of SJP, it depends a lot on the particular chapter of SJP. I mean, we are very, very open on campuses around the country to the kind of conversation I think that Ambassador Ayalon is saying, that the question of, do you keep those with whom you disagree close, or do you cast them out and say you refuse to speak to them? It is our belief that the strength of the Jewish people comes out of the arguments that we've had over the centuries and the millennia, that in fact that is something, a value that we have treasured and held high in our scholarship and in our learning. And we shouldn't, as a matter of course, say that we refuse to sit down with and refuse to talk to the people with whom we have disagreements. There are chapters of SJP that are interested in understanding the narrative that we have about our people and our connection. Our students are often interested in sitting down and understanding the narrative and where the students of Palestinian descent are coming from. And I don't see a problem with sitting down with those with whom you have disagreements and trying to understand and get to the root of that. That's different from choosing to work with an organization that is doing things that you don't agree with and saying that you agree with those tactics and strategies, which we don't. J Street should be very, very clear. We are part of the Jewish community's response to the BDS movement. We are part of the shock troops that are sent out to campuses to make the argument. Why is BDS actually at its heart not a tactic that advances a peaceful resolution of this conflict? Why is it that the history of boycotts against Jewish people goes so deeply against the grain of who we are? Why should it bother our students to be involved in boycotts that target all of Israel? What is it about the BDS movement that doesn't recognize the right of the Jewish people to a state? Those are things that we think are very important to explain. And if you don't sit down and you don't talk to folks who you disagree with, how will they ever hear this case? How can you hope to shift some minds? How can you hope to find some common ground? We don't cede an inch on our interests. We don't cede an inch on our principles. But to sit down and to work with those with whom we disagree, we believe is a show of strength and is in the best tradition of our people.
Thank you, Mr. Ben-Ami. So we'll move on to the next question. This one's for Mr. HaKohen. So what do you mean when you say we should not blame people who fight for us for being colonialists, do you justify Arabs killing Jews?
I prefer not to see any violence at all, but I can understand the frustration a person feels when his entire life is controlled by a military bureaucracy, a military occupation. Now, again, I say the Jews in Judea are not the Americans in Afghanistan. The problem is we're behaving like the Americans in Afghanistan. Israel could shrink all the way to Herzliya, and we still won't have peace as long as we insist on being a Western satellite in the Middle East, as long as we're perceived as colonialists. The answer, if anybody is genuinely interested in peace, is to start to understand the other's narrative. Mr. Ambassador, you said earlier that the Palestinian narrative is completely false. I disagree with that. And like J Street, I engage with SJP on most campuses I work on, and I see that what they're saying is also true.
30 seconds.
The Palestinian narrative is also true. What they've experienced is true. Where I draw the line is with what they say about us. The only ideological difference between me and SJP is that I believe the Jewish people are an indigenous Middle Eastern people with a right to self-determination between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. Okay? Other than that, in terms of values, I agree with 90% of what the SJP is saying. The way Israel is treating the Palestinians today is wrong and it needs to stop, but the solution is not to partition our country into two states. That solution has not worked, it will not work, it cannot work, and it should not work because it would be an injustice for both peoples.
Thank you, Mr. HaKohen. These are the last 3 questions before we have our closing statements. So, next question is for the ambassador. Okay, so for the ambassador. As Jews living in the US, don't we have an interest in the Zionist project in Israel? Prime Minister Sharon said, quotes, Israel is not an Israeli project, Israel is a project of the Jewish people, end quote. How can you say we can't speak to Israel's interests from here in the US?
Can you repeat that?
Okay, so
No, just the last
the last phrase is, how can you say we can't speak to Israel's interests from here in the US?
No, I didn't say that. I just said that Israel's interest from here would be better served if there is advocacy for Israel, political support for Israel. But as far as defending Israel, as far as taking the political decisions in Israel, you have to be an Israeli citizen. This is just the rule of law for any country. Now, Yehuda, I must tell you that I am astounded. For you to tell me that the Palestinian narrative is not false is completely denying the Jewish narrative. Or maybe one of us do not interpret right the Palestinian narrative. The Palestinian narrative is that there was never a Jewish state, that we are colonialists, that we are aliens to the land, that we are sons of apes and monkeys. There was never a Jewish temple, and even in the Quran, they interpret the pasuk in the Quran, which says that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. They say we are not the Jewish people, sons of Kuzaris and all kinds of things. So I cannot accept the Palestinian narrative, and I will never accept the Palestinian narrative. This is something that we have to establish very from the very beginning. Secondly, I do take an issue.
30 seconds.
I do take an issue about Israel is not a vassal state to anyone. Our friendship with the United States is very much based on mutual respect and also mutual trust. And yes, we do agree to disagree on the issues of the settlements and Jerusalem and others. We agree to disagree, but unlike other countries which take the disagreement and contaminate bilateral relations, the United States has not done so, and I believe it should never do so. And this is what's the difference between relations between Israel and the United States and Israel and any other countries.
Okay, so Mr. HaKohen, we'll leave you for a quick 30 seconds response, and then we're going to wrap up with closing statements.
Sure. Almost every week I give a tour of Hebron. I'm part of an organization that gives a dual narrative tour, which means participants spend half a day with me and they spend half a day with the Palestinian, touring Hebron. And they get my version of what is Hebron, the Jewish perspective of what is Hebron, and they get the Palestinian perspective on what's happening in Hebron. And one of the things I tell the participants on this program, remember, these aren't Jews or Arabs, these are like white people from America and Europe and other places. And I tell them, when I tell you about the Jewish narrative, when I tell you about what the Jews are experiencing here, what the Jews want in Hebron, what we're doing in Hebron, why we're living in Hebron, believe me. But don't let me tell you what the Palestinians want. Meaning, when we talk about, for example, Shel Hevet Pas, when we talk about a 10-month-old baby that was shot in the head by a sniper in Hebron, I can't begin to try and explain that, what was going through somebody's mind who squeezed that trigger. But Shel Hevet Pas. But when a Palestinian tells you what I'm doing in Hebron, don't believe him. Meaning, believe him when he tells you how he's experienced Hebron. His narrative, how he is experiencing the last 100 years of the conflict, believe him, because that is very true, but don't let him tell you who I am. Don't let him tell you what Jews are doing in Hebron. Both our narratives are true. We have to listen to the other, but we can't define the other. The way you defined what Palestinians want, or what it says in the Quran, the majority of Arabs living between the Mediterranean and the Jordan are not religious. They don't fast on Ramadan, at least not privately. They're not people who derive their political views from an ancient book. They're people who are legitimately experiencing an occupation and want to resist it. And I, as a human being, can't blame them. That is true. What they say about us, what they say about our history, where we're from. I'm a HaKohen, I know exactly what tribe I'm from. And I say so to my Palestinian colleagues. But I am not going to pretend that his narrative doesn't exist and that he's not really a Palestinian experiencing what the Israeli military is doing to him.
Thank you, Mr. HaKohen. We're going to move on to our closing remarks. So, Mr. Ben-Ami, you've been chosen to go first. You'll have about 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Terrific. Well, first of all, let me just thank not only the organizers and not only my fellow panelists, but I want to thank everybody who's here tonight. It was a very respectful audience. I'm sure that there was a lot you heard that you disagreed with from many different perspectives. I think it's extraordinarily important that there is such a large turnout and that students are here and engaging and hearing different perspectives. So kol hakavod to all of you, kol hakavod to the organizers. I'm very, very pleased to be a part of this event. I do want to say that J Street is interested in talking to any of you who may be interested in our work. I saw that Andrew Gordon-Kirsch just stood up. He is our student organizer in this region. He would be very interested in talking to any of you who might have found what I have to say tonight or might find what J Street stands for of interest. Please feel free to approach him afterwards. I know that a group of students are getting together at Tiberius Cafe on 34th Street. I understand that you all know where that is. And at 34th, and you all know where it is, Lexington. Excellent. And so anybody who'd like to join Andrew and some of the students from here to continue the conversation, please feel free. I certainly look forward to future opportunities to continue this conversation. There is a lot that we share in common regarding Jewish values and the treatment of the other. There's a lot that we share in common regarding a sense of what is existentially necessary for this project of Zionism to survive. I think we disagree on how to get there. And it's a very vibrant, very important, historically important conversation for us as the Jewish people. And so I thank you for taking part in it. So.
Thank you, Mr. Ben-Ami, the ambassador. You've been chosen to go next.
Well, thank you very much.
A minute and 30 seconds.
Starting now, right?
Starting 15 seconds ago.
Well, again, I think I enjoyed it very much. I think what you saw here is really the epitome of Jewish self-criticism and machloket, and it's machloket l'shem shamayim, and everyone has a legitimate view. And I think part of our tradition is to do the pilpulim and to debate among ourselves, to make ourselves better and to make our people better prepared for the challenges of the future. But we can all talk our heads off. If we do not have a partner for peace, it's all staying within our four corners here. So come what may, I want you to remember one thing. The Jewish necessity to always have not just the right of self-determination to our land, but also the capability and the will to defend ourselves by ourselves and not to let our destiny to be in the hands of anyone.
30
we
seconds.
know from our own history, we know from history of people today, whether it's the Syrians or the people in Darfur, who cannot defend themselves by themselves. And to finish off, I want you to go out with this moral and this story. You all remember, not that you remember from history, Henry Kissinger, the legendary Secretary of State. He came in 1973, 1974, after the Yom Kippur War, to try to make peace between Israel and Syria and Israel and Egypt, the disengagement. He was shuttling like crazy between Jerusalem and Cairo, Jerusalem and Damascus. He was very busy, and you know why? His people, his staffers made sure he would be busy, because when he wasn't busy, he would drive them crazy. So one day in Jerusalem at the King David, they wake up in the morning and they see that there is a window on his calendar, 2 hours with nothing to do. They say, oy vey, you know, he's going to drive us crazy, let's find something quickly for him to do. Somebody had the idea, let's send him to the biblical zoo. You know the biblical zoo in Jerusalem? Okay, he liked the idea. They take him to the biblical zoo, he tours around in the zoo, and he finishes the tour in the lion's cage. And there he sees a ferociously looking lion playing very nicely with the lamb. He couldn't believe his eyes. He turns to the manager of the zoo, he says, wow, this is Isaiah prophecy right here in Jerusalem. I need to know how you did it. I need to make peace in Vietnam, here in the Middle East, how did you do it? And the answer was, very simply, we bring a fresh new lamb every day. So just remember, even we cross the T's and dot the I's in peace agreement with the Palestinians or anyone else, the Jewish people should be the lion and not the lamb. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Last closing remarks, Mr. HaKohen.
I'm used to this, Mike. I'm going to agree with the ambassador that Israel shouldn't see ourselves as a lamb. The problem is we do see ourselves as a lamb. Meaning in the conflict in the Middle East, the Jewish people, Israel very much identifies as the lamb and not as a lion and not as the wolves. We see ourselves essentially as a lamb surrounded by wolves, and because we're a lamb surrounded by wolves, we need checkpoints and walls and weapons to protect ourselves from the wolves. I think we're a wolf too. And if we're a wolf too, we have no problem getting along with our neighbors without checkpoints and walls, without fences. And quite frankly, I'm very uncomfortable. I live in Beit El. I live in the West Bank, and there's a fence around Beit El. And I don't see any reason for that fence, meaning I feel that the fence itself is a barrier, is an obstacle, and is something that puts in the minds of the Palestinians, first of all, I don't belong there, second of all, I'm afraid of them. Right? I'd rather be able to live freely on my land with my Palestinian neighbors. Now what I want to say to you is this. You have all been born in one of the most amazing and climactic chapters of Jewish history. For the first time in thousands of years, we have a Jewish state, we have a Jewish army, we have a Jewish government, we have a Jewish flag. Yet nearly the entire international community is trying to take a chunk of that from us. It's trying to take the cradle of Jewish civilization, the West Bank, from us.
20 seconds.
Now, you don't have to agree with what I had to say. You don't have to agree with the ambassador, Mr. Ben-Ami, but you do have to decide for yourself where we are in Jewish history, what you believe the next step is. What is the ideal future for the Jewish people? What is the next step in achieving that ideal? What are the greatest obstacles standing in the way of that next step? And what you can personally do in order to overcome that obstacle. Because at the end of the day, the purpose of life is not to be a successful American with kosher restaurants. The purpose of life is to be a character in Jewish history. And at best, the American Jewish community will be a footnote in the history books.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for coming out. It was nice, it was an honor, it was a privilege to moderate this panel between our three distinguished guests. I'm sure, as Mr. Ben-Ami alluded, I'm sure Mr. Ambassador and Mr. HaKohen will all be staying for a little bit and talking to the crowd. So if you have any questions for them, if they would like to answer, you come over to them. Thank you very much, and looking forward to having more events like this on campus, and have a great night.